Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for watching us today. I have here with me the distinct pleasure of a conversation with Dr. Susan Liautaud. Dr. Liautaud has had a fascinating career. She has a PhD in social policy from the London School of Economics, JD from Columbia, and that has led her to run her own boutique ethics advisory firm for leaders around the world. In addition to that advisory work, she's a lecturer at the public policy program at Stanford University. She's the chair of the board of trustees for the London School of Economics, vice chair for the Global Partnership for Education. She is currently running an initiative called the Ethics Incubator, and just this year, she published a book called The Power of Ethics. So Susan, thank you so much for joining me.
It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, Tyler.
So just to start us off, can you just tell me a little bit about your own career journey and how you ended up in a place to be doing such interesting work, founding an ethics consultancy and advising these people around the world?
So I started out as a corporate lawyer, and it was actually an interesting experience. I had the good fortune to be at a firm called Sullivan & Cromwell. And at the time, the part of it that was most intriguing to me is that I was looking at first ever transactions, all of which were international. And that meant there was this constant tension between what I was expected to do as a lawyer and what the law provided in terms of guidance. And it suited me perfectly because my passion and sort of what drives my day is complex problem solving. So there was a lot of it, and in particular by large law firm standards. But that was back in the day when derivative securities were brand new. Nobody really knew what they were. And when the tech industry was just starting. And so little by little, I started to see that the law was really lagging behind the kinds of work that we needed to be doing. And then on a personal front, at the time I was living in Paris in Sullivan Cromwell's Paris office. And on a personal front, I had to move to California, which is my home base anyway. And they didn't have an office. And so I was really lucky to land as an associate dean for international and graduate programs at Stanford Law School. And I had a lot of flexibility there as well to develop curriculum, both curriculum in the business world and curriculum in the NGO world. And there again, that was the beginning of Apple and some of the really big, important landmark moments in Silicon Valley. And I started to see, wow, the law is just not enough. And so I started exploring that with my students. Fast forward, I had to move again for family reasons. We had to move to London. And I started to look more broadly at issues around governance and accountability. And then over time into ethics, because I started to realize that it was really a lot about decision making, that successful organizations, and that even organizations that were respecting the law, very much came down to how they made good decisions, who made the decisions, who was empowered to make decisions and who wasn't. And so over time, this passion for ethics evolved. And it really, I really take a view across all sectors. So I work with the corporate sector, with NGOs, with government, and with academia. And I also very much believe that we shouldn't put ethics in silos, that we shouldn't have necessarily, with a couple of exceptions, like medical ethics, we shouldn't have, just business ethics or just tech ethics, or just NGO ethics, because all of these worlds are bleeding together. And indeed, we need to make them bleed together in order to solve today's problems. So that was basically the trajectory. The common elements from beginning to today is, again, a passion for complex problem solving. And that's really what my book does, is it tries to democratize ethics. It tries to make ethics really accessible to people from all walks of life, from corporate CEOs to employees who may have started work a couple of weeks ago.
Quite the interesting trajectory, and I'm sure we're going to get into all of those themes that you have braided through your career as we go on in this conversation. So we are actually speaking today in part because earlier this year, you had our CEO, Tim Erblick, on for an interview at the Ethics Incubator, which is a new project of yours. Can you tell us just a little bit about what the Ethics Incubator is, who the intended audience is, and what you're hoping to accomplish with it?
Sure. So the Ethics Incubator is a nonprofit project, and it is basically a series of discussions with people from different specialty areas. So I have a group of interviews, for example, on ethics in the arts. And I have wonderful guests like the architect Frank Gehry, or the head of the Royal College of Arts in London, or the writer Sir Salman Rushdie. I have also a section on ethics of truth, and I look there at other kinds of questions, and a section that's more on tech. And I was really privileged to interview Tim because his reach is so vast. But the Ethics Incubator is really about discussion, and it's really, again, about this passion of mine of looking at ethics from many different perspectives.
And I was struck by I think that the three big buckets that you've sort of divided your interviewees into are artists and entrepreneurship, and then I forget what the third one is, but it was something else that it seemed to me that one of the, I guess, the through line that I found in them all was some element of creativity, right? You needed some sort of spark of inspiration to be doing the work that these folks were doing.
Right. So one of the other specialty areas is ethics of truth, although I shouldn't really call that a specialty area because that really applies to everybody. And I love the fact that you picked up spark of creativity, because I think even all of the wonderful organizations affiliated with Ethisphere, many of them corporate, there's a lot of creativity in how we embed ethics into an organization. And if we don't leave room for that creativity, it just becomes more compliance.
Absolutely. So now I want to get a little bit into the book that you published earlier this year, The Power of Ethics, which is geared towards helping people to make ethical decisions. And you explicitly said that you wanted the prescriptions in the book to be useful for an individual, for a group, for a company, right, at all
Absolutely.
levels. So in the book's framework, and please correct me if I summarize anything incorrectly, but you advise decision makers to do 4 things as part of their process. Identify their guiding principles, assess whether they have enough information or all of the information that they could have, identify all stakeholders and their needs, and evaluate potential consequences over time, so not just immediately. For most of our audience, right, who are folks operating within companies at kind of that highest large-scale organizational level, companies at this point, values are sort of a table stakes thing, right? Whether or not companies take them seriously, nearly every organization has identified, what are
Right.
our core key values, what are the things that should be guiding our decision-making from day to day. And so most companies have that part identified, right? Then you get to the information question, and that to me is, I think, where you start to run into some of the challenges for corporate folks, right?
Right. So the information challenge is really interesting. The way a lot of the complicated ethics challenges work today, and I do want to be careful to distinguish between things that I would call plain vanilla. We don't commit fraud. I don't deal with that kind of thing. I mean, my assumption is that, that is being dealt with by hardcore compliance. There's a lot about what I do that drives behaviors that prevent that or that minimize the risk of that. But a lot of what I'm looking at is what happens when we face questions that we've never faced before, or what happens when we face questions that we've never succeeded at solving before, like cultures of sexual misconduct, like cultures of racism. So the issue around information is that we have been so obsessed about making sure we have all the information when in fact we never can. And what I'm trying to do is to shift the focus and say, what is the information that you need or you wish you had that you don't have? What's the gap? And that's where the risk lies. So you can assess, you need to monitor decisions over time based on that gap in information. And where is that gap growing? Is it different today? Is there different information you need today than you needed 6 months ago? And I think we get so obsessed with the idea that we're going to get every last piece of information, and no company will. There just aren't the financial resources, there aren't the human resources, and in many cases, the science doesn't allow us to have it. I mean, the COVID vaccine decision-making is a perfect example of that. We have to live with the state of science, so to speak. But the idea is that I would like people to be more focused on the information that they think they should have that they don't have, because that's where the ethics risk lies.
Mm-hmm. How good would you say most organizations are at that question? The question of identifying the known unknowns and figuring out how they can get closer to having some information about that.
So
Is
that's
that
a great
something,
question
a
because
capacity that most, sorry, is that something most companies already can do, or is that really a struggle?
No, it's really a struggle. And there are three reasons why it's a struggle. Sometimes it's a struggle because the structures in place, even with the best structured ethics and compliance companies, don't really promote that kind of thinking. So this is designed to be much more efficient. If you're looking for the information you don't have and trying to figure out the risk around that, it's a lot more efficient than trying to make sure you have every last grain of sand. But very often companies are just not designed to think that way. The second reason is that sometimes there's willful blindness. People don't want to see the information, or they have the information right in front of them, and they certainly don't want to share it with the stakeholders who need it. And those stakeholders might be pilots on a Boeing aircraft or airlines that are purchasing a Boeing aircraft. Those stakeholders might be teenagers using Instagram. Those stakeholders might be, ordinary citizens who think that when they go to Walgreens, they're going to get a little blood test, and it's going to be a tiny little thing, and Theranos is going to tell them everything they think they need to know. So there's that part of it. And then there's just the part of it that almost every business today is in one way or another linked up to serious technology. I would almost go so far as to say is that almost every business has some relationship to AI, even if it's just that they're using Google, right? Or that they're, that they have a platform on Facebook or something. And that's where we get into information that we just don't fully understand yet. We just don't fully understand the implications of all of that. And businesses need to be, in my view, at a point where that's where the gap in information should be, causing people to press pause instead of to kind of hold their noses and leap.
Mm-hmm. Getting the first and second things that you mentioned there, the structures in place that don't promote looking for the information that you don't have, and then the concept of willful blindness. Mm-hmm. And not wanting to share information with certain stakeholders. I think that's those two together are at the root of a lot of company problems. I mean, you gave the example of Facebook, and we're speaking just maybe a month after the revelations that Facebook had all of this internal research about a variety of problems mm-hmm. that it then, whether it was the impact of Instagram usage on teenager self-esteem, or the ways that misinformation about the vaccine was spreading on the platform, things like that they had the information, and then essentially they chose to spin it or downplay it rather than saying, okay, well, we're now going to operationalize this, right? Or, we're going to give this to stakeholders who can help us work towards a solution. How can companies build a culture where A, they actively want to seek out potentially unpleasant information, and B, they are not afraid of the short term, I think often very difficult, but certainly in the long term, healthier mm-hmm. choice to confront those problems and work through them?
That is a great question. And, I would be remiss if I didn't say that there's always risk, because this comes down to everybody's individual situation. It could be an individual boss, or it could be the CEO of a company, or for that matter, it could be a government leader who is just driving a culture of fear. Let me start by saying fear is one of the most toxic and potent drivers of unethical behavior, because people start to make decisions for all kinds of reasons other than the best ethical decision-making for themselves and for the organization and for the other stakeholders. One of the things that organizations can do is to take a look at their performance evaluation processes. So for example, I've worked with organizations to put in place ways that you can benefit either financially or otherwise from the times that you speak up, that the corporation actively rewards, actively notes positively in performance evaluations, times that you speak up. And that speaking up doesn't necessarily have to be, I detected this internal research report on the environmental impact of, our pollution. But it might be even speaking up to say, my colleague on another team did a fantastic job on this. We all should learn from this particular thing. And in fact, I tell my Stanford students as an aside, never miss an opportunity to shout out somebody's good work. and never miss an opportunity to decline calling out somebody's mistake, because it will be us making the mistake someday. But I mean, so embedding a lot of this in performance evaluation in a more straightforward way than simply, in a more creative way, to use your earlier word, than simply saying, oh, this person hasn't committed fraud, so therefore they deserve their bonus, which is basically a lot of what's been going on. The other thing is, I am a big believer in redundancy. So there's safety in numbers. So a concrete example, I just worked with an organization to set up a very efficient way that anytime someone is hired, there is a very thorough process for checking for sexual misconduct and that kind of thing in the history of the candidate. But a second person has to review the first person's process, research, interview notes, etc., so that there are two sets of eyeballs on this very, very important issue for this particular organization about preventing the hiring of somebody with a history of sexual misconduct who could be exposed to vulnerable people. So I think redundancy, I think people can find ways to have more than one set of eyeballs on problems and speak up in pairs, and try to also structure discussions where it becomes normal to say, what didn't we do right? To say, what would somebody, what would a teenager say about this? And actually the point about stakeholders is, what would all of our different stakeholders say about this? And let's not forget that stakeholders include regulators. So some of this, willful blindness comes back to bite, because it's much easier to be in an offensive situation than in a defensive situation. It's much easier to say, we discovered this, we don't quite know what to do with it yet. We are investigating it. We don't have any reason to believe that there's a reason we need to change our product now, but we are, on the front foot with this. Much better than to be constantly hauled into Washington. Right.
Or to communicate just like, this is the problem that we have identified. We're not sure yet what the solutions are, but we're bringing it, I think that kind of thing is the sort of thing that has the potential to get a lot of companies a lot of goodwill, but for whatever reason, the default position is, well, if we shove this far enough away, then it'll just never emerge. And I'm just not sure that in an era where it's easier and easier for employees to go to the media, go to regulators, to speak up as whistleblowers, that is ever going to be the right choice again. I don't know, maybe 50 years ago that it was possible. I'm just not sure that now that ever is.
Right. I mean, I think you make a great point. And there's two kinds of speaking up. I mean, we don't want to be just running to the media every time the company has an issue, and there is responsibility for stock price and things like that as well. And I should say, I'm very pro innovation. I'm very pro profit. I'm very pro business, and I want to be clear about that. So the whole way we deal with the market, there's also a responsibility there. But in particular, in certain industries where the work that is happening is far ahead of the regulation, where we're talking about social media or AI-driven industries or things like that, the companies themselves have a responsibility to step up and say, you know what, this could be a real problem. We're not even sure yet what the scope of the problem is. Instead of having, say, a facial recognition technology company have to be stopped by Microsoft saying, by government. So you do have some positive examples, like Microsoft saying, we will not sell our facial recognition technology to police forces until we have proper human rights regulation in place. Amazon also put a quash on that for a year's time. So there are times when companies do that, and I just think they need to do it more. There are other times when there are reasons why companies can't speak up. But I think you're absolutely right. If we look at, for example, the opioid crisis, I've often asked myself if the early days of the Sackler tragedy, if that could actually happen today with social media and with access to the internet and the like. It's just too easy for somebody, even an employee of a drugstore, these so-called pill mills, or, it's just too easy for somebody to speak up.
That's an interesting question. And I think that gets now moving into the kind of the third component of your decision-making apparatus for folks to be thinking about, is identifying stakeholders and their interests, which for a company actually requires folks to set up channels to gather input from stakeholders, right? Because internally, you're not necessarily going to hear from people in the communities where you're operating in the same way, right? Or people impacted by further down your supply chain or something like that. How do you guide companies through the process of weighing stakeholder needs in a situation where there is no obvious short-term win-win, right? I'm putting in short-term for a reason because I think a lot of what we're talking about here really comes down to companies avoiding a hit in the short term and ignoring the possibility that the long-term potential outcome is better for everyone involved if they are actually willing to do the hard work of addressing something in the present.
Mm-hmm. So I think, first of all, that the world is moving toward diminishing patience for short-term thinking, or I should say diminishing patience with failure to consider stakeholder interests. And we certainly saw that with the Business Roundtable and purpose-driven organizations. But we're seeing that, for example, with Paul Pullman's recent book. And so most of the companies that I know of are much more aware of different stakeholders than they were in the past. Now, some of the stakeholder analysis is complicated today for reasons I'll get to in a minute that are linked to technology. Others come back to willful blindness, though. And if you take an example like the Bangladeshi garment factories, I heard many companies say, but we can't know who all the people are in our supply chain, who all the intermediaries are. And my answer is yes, you can. This is a chain of contracts, right? This is not an abstract concept. All you have to do is literally follow the money. You just need to invest enough resources and enough commitment that from the point of departure of headquarters all the way to Bangladesh, you are going to know exactly what everybody's doing. And you're going to monitor that over time. Now, does that cost a little more? Does that mean that maybe executive bonuses are a little bit less? Does that mean maybe there's a slight difference in dividends or in share price? Does that mean that the t-shirt is $2.75 instead of $2.50? Or even that you can't make certain products cheaply enough anymore? Yes, of course it does. But there's a whole category of things today that should be sort of no-brainers. And then we look at things where the technology really complicates our ability to envisage the impact on stakeholders. So for example, a product like 23andMe, we just don't know really what's going to happen when somebody discovers various, elements of their genetic makeup and the potential implications for disease. But then you have to think about, wow, there are stakeholders that never bought a 23andMe kit who are affected. What about, the husband who finds out that the wife now knows that, he's actually not the father of their children? Or what about somebody who discovers they have an inheritable disease and now they feel an obligation to tell the siblings? So there's these impacts on stakeholders who never asked to be stakeholders. And that's more of a problem around the technology area. And then finally, what I would say, and I talk about this in the book also, is what are consumers, what are the customers of businesses going to do with the products? So in fairness to social media companies, that wasn't designed as a vehicle for hate speech. Right. In fairness to Robinhood, Robinhood, the trading app, was not designed to be weaponized against hedge funds. So consumers also have responsibility. And the way I look at that with companies now is to say, it's too easy just to say that consumers have responsibility. What is your responsibility to explain to the consumers their responsibility and to help them fulfill those responsibilities?
Well, yeah, and those two examples are interesting because, Facebook's, obviously Facebook was not built to, spread vaccine disinformation when it was first conceived. But, it is possible, and many people have proposed various ways that, the platform could be changed, adjusted, better internally moderated to address that very obvious negative externality of, the connections that it has built. Whereas for Robinhood, people would say, well, the platform was never intended to be weaponized against a hedge fund. Arguably, that's not a terrible thing. Depending on what the hedge fund is doing. And, at the very least, other people would say, it's a wash because it's just the market, right? Like this is something that is morally neutral in some capacity. And so, there's, what it highlights there is the ability to say, I guess find the areas of gray or in your definition of who is being impacted or how they're being impacted, if you are looking for it.
Right. So let me just come back to your word obvious with respect to social media. Because I find the supply chain example also obvious, meaning there are certain things that are so clearly dire, that are so clearly threats to human life, literally, that how can you possibly defend not doing something about it when you can, or at least not doing more, right? So I think you gave an example of something that is really black and white as opposed to gray there. Now, the Robinhood thing, the issue is that, you know, the hedge funds are sophisticated investors. They will find their way out of whatever loss they may incur based on this manipulation. But some of the individual investors who were hurt by that particular event,
the people who got left holding the bag when the stock price finally collapsed.
You know, so and just to give an example, one step further, Robinhood, according to recent press, is now cultivating clients at universities, right? So that is a very vulnerable population, right? It's a population of, you know, today, especially young people, there are a lot of them that think they just want to find schemes to get rich quick. It's very tempting the way it's being presented, just the way, I mean, the media, the mainstream media.
Yeah, well, and they're less sophisticated. There's been all the discussion of the degree to which Robinhood is sort of building gamification or other addictive qualities into the platform, and that to me, again, that's a different discussion than, because you're talking about a different stakeholder than the hedge fund.
Absolutely,
right?
Absolutely. But the fact that nobody has much sympathy for hedge funds doesn't mean that the behavior of the individuals to use that platform manipulatively was right. Doesn't mean that innocent people weren't hurt, and doesn't mean that the company doesn't have a responsibility to press pause and say, wait a minute, our platform is being weaponized. What should we do about this? How should we change our terms of service, which, by the way, are 33 pages of micro print legalese.
Of course.
And, you know, maybe we shouldn't be cultivating clients across university campuses the way, as the mainstream media very effectively pointed out, the way credit card companies used to. And as you say, an addictive, sort of the latest addiction.
Well, and once again, that it seems to be an indication of some of more short-term thinking that is willfully blind to potential long-term consequences of, you know, what is it going to look like for that company in a few years if their major impact on the world has been to, you know, bankrupt a large chunk of the people who they recruited as impressionable 21-year-olds.
Right.
You know, what kind of negative attention is that going to bring them in the future? What kind of potentially aggressive regulation is that going to bring on their industry, that if they had just, you know, behaved in a more principled manner, they might never have attracted in the first place, right?
And I think what's interesting in what you're just saying is, like, I'm not entirely sure that some of the people who are making these decisions actually care much about what their reputations are, or quite frankly, care what the regulation is down the road. Because to your point about short-termism, their win, so to speak, can happen in a very short period of time. The company gets bought, the company goes public, whatever it is, the company goes public.
Well, and it is, there's something about that startup mentality and culture that gets built at startups that even after they do IPO, it lingers for a while, or, you know, in the case of a company like Facebook, arguably the culture has never fundamentally shifted from the move fast and break things because we're trying to get our exit as quickly as possible. That a longer standing public company, or a company that has been withstanding public scrutiny for a longer time, maybe eventually develops more of those, I don't even know if I would call it cautious, but more of that sense of a long-term perspective.
And let me just be clear about one thing. I said earlier that I'm pro-innovation, and I cannot emphasize that enough. I think one of the things, if we step back on this theme of stakeholders, is there's a pretty straightforward question that anybody in an organization can ask themselves, that to me is the most important question, and that is, what is going to be the impact on the person who is most adversely affected by your decision? And that's a question that, we can ask in life, in any kind of decisions, in family ethics, in community ethics, et cetera. You don't have to be a multilateral corporation. And when we start to think in those terms, we start to be very careful about being too dismissive of innovation. So I really want to distinguish between the value of innovation and the value of taking risks around innovation and the just bad business behavior that innovation or not shouldn't happen. It wouldn't matter whether the Robinhood app was owned by a startup or owned by, a major financial services company. The fact of trying to peddle addiction on college campuses is a bad idea. It's not the actual innovation itself. But just to give you a concrete example, I listened to something the other day, and I actually spoke with a very senior AI scientist who said, "Oh my goodness, I would never go into a driverless car." And I was thinking to myself, I'm sitting here right now in Silicon Valley, and I have beautiful roads and beautiful weather, and there's rule of law. So there are rules of the road, and they are by and large enforced. And we have medical attention if, God forbid, anybody gets in an accident. But if you look at the statistics for developing economy countries, say World Bank statistics of a couple of years ago, it is shocking the percentage of deaths from automobile accidents, how much higher it is in those countries. The roads are terrible. There is no particular rule of law. There is no medical care. The quality of the cars can be terrible. They're not kept in good repair. And so the stakes and the ethical consequences and the ethical balancing is very different. And I think sometimes where I see this in terms of the Ethisphere group is you have some phenomenal multinational corporations. LOreal comes to mind. I've spent a lot of time studying LOreal. They do a wonderful job of taking into consideration different cultures, and also the fact that when you're thinking about innovation, the stakes are quite different depending on whether you're looking at Palo Alto, California, or whether you're looking at a developing country. So I think that's, I think we need to distinguish between taking risks for innovation and the ethics of that versus just bad business behavior that sometimes people attribute to innovation, when in fact it would just be bad business behavior, whether it was done by a startup or not.
Can you, since you mentioned L'Oreal, can you go a little bit deeper into what that looks like for them? Because we've been talking about, I think by and large, lots of, we mentioned Facebook, we mentioned Robinhood, you mentioned self-driving cars, which, has been research from Uber and Google and Waymo and others. But, what does that look like at a more quote unquote low tech business, right? What does it look like for a business like that to be considering stakeholders in different places in different ways?
Yeah, so I have to say, Tyler, like you, my first instinct is to say L'Oreal is, makeup and shampoo and it's low tech. But in fact, it is a very scientific based company and a very high tech company. But you're absolutely right to, that's our instinct. So L'Oreal is a company that is really well known to Ethisphere, as are its leaders. Emmanuel Lulin was the chief ethics officer until recently, and others. And so just to link this back to the earlier part of our conversation, one of L'Oreal's values has been courage. So they're basically saying, speaking up is important, and they do a lot, but one of their core values is actually linked to this whole idea of speaking up. And they do a number of things like an ethics day where people get to ask questions to the CEO and the CEO doesn't get to filter them in advance. There are a number of ways that the organization really cultivates speaking up. But, they have a lot of extremely difficult questions, because any company, whether it's L'Oreal or whether it's Google or, any company operating in so many countries, is going to face very difficult cultural questions, is going to face very difficult questions of what happens when you're operating in a country with an authoritarian regime, is going to face very difficult questions when you're dealing with different religious traditions, and how advertising could be offensive or not, how product packaging could be offensive or not. And again, this question of, from my white woman from the West perspective, I might find a product very offensive if I'm, having a discussion with someone about equity, diversity, and inclusion and anti-discrimination. But, who am I to say that somebody in another country might not think a product is really important to their well-being, their sense of well-being, and their sort of cultural traditions? So they do a wonderful job of that. But all of the big multinational companies, one of the questions that they have to face is, how do you drive ethics consistently across all of these different cultures, all of these different legal regimes, and indeed all of these different political regimes? And I think one of the answers is, you have certain things that are as consistent as possible, but you're realistic. You don't put people in harm's way. You don't expect somebody in a country with a certain kind of authoritarian regime to speak up in the same way.
Mm-hmm. So we're coming to the end of our time, but I did want to give you a chance. I know that right before we began recording, you mentioned that you're working on your next book. You have the manuscript back now. Would you want to tease just a little bit what you're trying to do with your next book and what it's going to be about?
Sure, and thank you for asking. So the mission that sort of undergirds all of my work is this idea of democratizing ethics. And again, just making ethical decision-making accessible to people from all walks of life. And I think that's very, very important in the corporate world, because it prevents sort of CEO speak and then nobody else is involved in the conversation. And so I think the language, and that's why, by the way, my framework in the first book is 4 words, so that everybody can get a handle on these 4 words. But this book is a bit different. It is a question and answer book. It can be used to trigger conversation, and it asks questions in a number of different topics. I touch on family and friends, on technology, on the workplace, on consumer kinds of issues. And so the chapters are thematic, but the questions can be read in any order. And what I do is I give perspective. I certainly don't think that I have all the answers, but I'm trying to give everyone in a fun and entertaining way a chance to grapple with, by themselves or with friends over dinner or while waiting in line, a chance to grapple with some of today's most interesting ethics questions, and to give people in literally 200 or 300 words enough information that they feel that they can actually have an opinion. Because many of us actually, when it comes right down to it, we don't really know how Spotify works. We don't really know actually what vaping is. We don't really know what mandatory voting is. So I give in a very, very short, easy to read way, I give enough information and some guidelines about how I think about the question, and then invite conversations. So it's meant to be a conversation starter.
Well, that's really interesting. And I have to say that I think everyone at Ethisphere would agree that the mission of trying to democratize ethics and conversations around ethics and empower individuals to grapple with those kinds of questions is incredibly important in today's world. And thank you so much for doing that work.
Well, I have to say, I just admire Ethisphere so much. I admire the leadership. I admire all the organizations that are engaging with you. And it's really, really a pleasure to speak with you, Tyler. It's a wonderful, wonderful organization, and a very, very important one that has had a huge impact.
Well, thank you very much. I hope we can continue to have that impact and live up to the expectations of you and others who are a fan of our work. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, this is Dr. Susan Liautaud.